In this lesson, we'll learn a few different methods of creating or having particles at frame 0 to begin our render, and we'll take a look at Softimage's render pass system to see how we can output our particles. So here's where we left off, and we have our particles working nicely in our scene. So now let's say we want to render them. Now of course at frame 1 there's nothing, and then suddenly on frame 2 there are some particles. So we need to be careful with this because obviously particles just don't appear from nothingness. So there's a few different ways around this. Of course we could have a geometry in here to hold the space, but there are a few ways we can actually pre-generate or tell Softimage to keep the particles that are already there. So the easiest way to do this, in my opinion, is to just do a few frames of pre-simulation. So we're not stuck from 0 to a number. We can actually go something like -25. And what this will now do is, if we do -25 in the box above, is we can start our simulation and then begin rendering at frame 0. So what this does is it gives us a nice little start for our simulation to exist. Now, if you don't want to do that and you want to set these particles to be there at the beginning, what we can do is we can play our simulation until we want a time or until the particles are there that we want to start with. Let's say just for a few frames. And what we can do is we can go up to Simulate, Edit under Ice, and Set Initial State. And what this will do is whenever we rewind our playback, it will start at that state. So instead of having to pre-simulate, we can set our timeline back to 0, and no matter when we start, it will always have whatever particles we place inside of that initial state. So that's two ways we can have particles there so that it doesn't look strange when we actually render them. So now let's take a look at Softimage's render system. Now currently I'm inside of my camera. Now that means that my view is being cut off at my render size. You'll notice these gray bars or almost gray letterboxing going on. Now you could be in the user, which does not have this gray letterboxing, so it's usually the one I prefer working in. However, as soon as we need to render, we should switch back to camera because this gives us a preview of exactly what is going to be inside of our frame. So let's zoom in and let's try to frame up our two beakers here. Do it from a slightly different angle, and let's just hold S and again left, middle, and right click to frame this up. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. And now we can come in and edit our render settings. So to edit your render settings, let me just cut off this panel here. We can go down to Render, Render, and then we have our scene options and our pass options, and finally the render options. So inside of our scene options, we have the choices, or we have the option to change our frame start and end. So let's set this to 250, and what type of a size file we have. And of course we could go down to custom format and specify what size and other things such as pixel ratio we want to add in. Now that we've set our scene render, we can jump over to the pass options, which let us change the picture format, which is pretty important. So down here under render channels output, let's just select this, and by default it's going to output a Softimage pic file, so we can edit this. And we could change it to something like a Targa or an OpenEXR. Now since I'm just going to render out a preview, I'm going to use JPEG. Obviously you shouldn't render out your final images into JPEGs because they will not look very good, but I'm just going to render out a preview. So to get back, we can always hit the back button up here, which is a really nice way of moving through these menus if you've gone through and done a lot of editing. And then finally, if you need to edit the render options, or sorry, the renderer options, this controls things such as quality settings and all of the normal things you would expect from a high quality renderer. And now that we've changed any of these settings that we wish to, we can simply begin the render by going to Render, Current Pass. And now Softimage is going to come in and render out our particles and anything that our camera sees. So it's going to give us a really nice feedback of what it's currently doing, how much longer it has, and how long the last frame took. So as we can see here, this is going to take a few minutes to render out, not only because it's a larger sequence, but because we have many particles appearing in our scene. So I'm just going to pause the video, and then as soon as this is finished rendering, we can take a look at it inside of a preview program. Okay, so here's our render, and let's take a look. We can see we have a little bit of a render problem in that our particles here are flashing. So let's take a look at why this is happening and what settings we're going to need to change to fix this. Okay, so I'm back here in Softimage, and let's reselect our particles here. And to fix this, we need to jump into our render tree. So let's hit the 7 key, and here pops up our render tree. You can just hit the refresh or update if it's not updated. And let's jump into the particle renderer and take a look at what's happening. Now, we're going to find this option inside of our volume rendering tab. Now, there's something called a shadow table, which is how ice creates the shadowing for these particles. Now, currently, we're at a cell size of 0.75. So that means that there is a cell for every 0.75 units inside of our scene. Now, this makes renders move much faster. I'll just hold Q and try to view this. This makes renders much faster. However, as you notice, there are sometimes some flickering issues depending on the size and scale of your scene. So if we want to remove the flickering issues, what we can do is we can reduce this cell size. Now, by default, it only goes down to 0.375, but I want to reduce it even further. I'm going to reduce it down to about 0.1. Now, what happens is the shadows will begin to be calculated with much more precision. Now, this is going to change the look of our particles slightly, so you always want to do a test render after changing your cell size. Now, decreasing the cell size is also going to increase our render time by quite a bit. So what we could do is we can experiment with various cell sizes until we no longer get a flickering result, and then render that out. Now, another way we could reduce the flickering is change the interpolation from linear to cubic. But since we're using such a small cell size, we shouldn't be able to see the interpolation. You'll know you'll need to change this interpolation when you can start to see the cell grids or lines inside of your shadow. So if we increase the cell size, we can begin to see the lines inside of our shadows. So if this happens, we can change this to cubic, and it will change how these shadow cells blend together. But for our case, we can keep this on linear and just reduce the cell size to something like 0.1. And that will give us all the shadow resolution we need to render out this project. Now, as with everything inside of rendering, this is going to be very dependent on your, again, scene size, particle size, and other factors inside of your render. So now that we've made this change, let's re-render this and take a look. So I'm just going to re-render this current pass, and as soon as this is finished, I'll jump back with a new video. Okay, here's our final particle simulation. And so as you can see, we have reduced or removed that flickering by reducing the cell size. Now, of course, there are always a few things we might want to tweak or change. I kind of want these particles to get a little darker, but of course, that's going to require another re-render, and I'm actually quite happy with how this came out. So that brings us to the end of this course, Getting Started with Ice. And as always, if you have any questions about ice or Softimage in general, feel free to join our forums where we have hundreds of helpful members and where we ourselves often go and answer questions. So I hope you enjoyed watching this course, and I can't wait to see what you can create by utilizing the powerful ice system inside of Softimage.